guys and girls. So about 18 months ago, back in September of 2020, I think it was, I released my CuMai tutorial video. Since then, as of recording this, it's had over 15,000 views, and it caused a bit of a stir because at the time, there were no tutorials out to make CuMai. Everybody who knew how to do it was kind of sitting on that information and not putting out tutorials. So when I did, it created a bit of a polarized response. Half the people hated the fact that I put that tutorial out, and half the people loved that I put that tutorial out. And now if you search YouTube, there are hundreds of videos on how to make CuMai, which is awesome because I believe that human knowledge belongs to the world, and having people out there using it now just makes me happy. It gives me the fizz. So that's awesome. But it did prove Cunningham's law, and all the people came out of the woodwork since then and told me that I'm doing it wrong. So I still get people bring up that video and pointing out that I did it wrong and assuming that I still do it that way. But I did have a few updates that I wanted to make to that video. Sort of because that it was an early days video, and I actually had to work it out myself simply because there were no tutorials out there. And so there are a few amendments I'd like to make to that video to make it up to date, and a few things I'd like to confirm. Now, me saying this, the method in that video will work. It will work great and make solid CuMai billets, and I still stand by it. I don't personally use that method as much anymore. Probably 80% of it I still do, but people thinking that I have not improved or refined my technique in 18 months clearly haven't been watching my social media and the knives that I make now. Let's run through a few things about that video. Now, in there, I actually say that you have to bring your billet up to a scorching heat, like a forge welding heat. Now, when I taught myself how to do this, I assumed that you would have to liquefy the copper to make it sticky enough to fill the void. And that was wrong. You only actually need to do a sheet braze. And a sheet braze can be achieved between steel and copper with pretty much a bright red heat. It's really not, it's like the Curie temperature of the steel is more than sufficient to be able to create a really solid sheet braze. Liquefying the copper will work. I mean, liquefied copper tends to braze to steel just like brazing temperature copper, but you don't need to get it that hot. And liquefying the copper does have the added risk of the squirt out, whereas brazing heats, it minimizes that risk. So you only really need to get to a brazing heat. The next amendment that I would like to make to the technique is that hitting it with a hammer will absolutely work, but you don't really need to hit it that hard. You just need light tap passes. The best thing to use is compression rather than impact, because there is a difference between the two of them. So if you have a press, that's really going to do a good job. And there's commercially available CuMai out there. A really good example is Coy Baker from Baker Forge and Tool. Makes beautiful stuff, just absolutely beautiful. I work with it myself now because despite all of my refinements to the process of making CuMai, it is still fiddly as hell, and you know, it's a time investment and an effort investment that, let me tell you, Coy makes lovely stuff, and I'd rather just buy it if I can. I still do make it from time to time, and have put out a couple of pieces recently, like this, that's with my own stuff. And but yeah, Coy uses presses and rolling mills, which is a really nice way to get even pressure rather than impacts. And because of that, you can get beautiful brazes. And control your thickness with a level of precision that I'd never be able to reach myself here with hammers and presses and such. So yeah, give Coy a look if you're wanting to just sort of get working with it right away. Yeah, brazing temperatures is all I use now. It's pretty much like a bright red, a dull orange is more than sufficient. But the main thing you want to try and do is get it evenly. Get the heat across there, that brazing heat even, which on the copper is actually really easy, because copper transfers heat beautifully. It's something that I don't really go into in the original video. If you were to hold one end of a bar of steel and have the other end in your forge, you can hold on to that bar of steel provided long enough, because the heat stays down one end. But if you would have like a 1 meter long rod of copper and you put that in one end of it in your forge, the end where your hand is going to get almost as hot. You're going to burn yourself, because heat transfers through copper. So when you put your billet in, if you're heating it sort of unevenly, which, some home-built forges do that. They have hot spots and things like that. And I've done videos before on designing forges to try and minimize that with like the cyclonic effects and whatnot. But a lot of the heat, if it's hot spotting, will transfer evenly throughout the copper. But you want to try and get your steel nice and hot as well, because hot steel will create a better braze. And what you're trying to avoid here is inclusions, which you can get even with a braze. And inclusions are basically little bubbles where the copper has not stuck to the steel. Now, the problem with CuMai is that you'll go through all this effort to make a billet, and you won't know if there's an inclusion there until you grind back bevels on that blade. And you'll find them pretty quick if they're in there. Which brings me to my final amendment, and that is forging on it. Now, in my original video, I talk about just don't forge it to shape. Don't hit it on the ends. And I still stand by that. There are people that will swear to you black and blue that you can forge it, and I'll be honest here, you can. You can forge it if you've used the right grade of copper, if you've brazed it correctly, if you've gone through all of the really precise steps to make it a perfect CuMai billet. Stuff like Coy's. You can forge on it if your hammer control's good, if your technique is good, but saying that, I still wouldn't. I wouldn't advise it either. I would consider it a stock removal only material. And the reason for that's actually just straight up logic. Because like I said, you can forge on it. But just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. I mean, I can ditch work and spend my entire day on the couch with a bag of licorice and half an ounce of weed, but I don't. I mean, that's for the weekends. But my point is, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Let's say you've got your CuMai billet here. You've got steel, 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 and copper, copper. When you strike this way, or this way, you're forcing the copper and the steel together. When you strike this way, or even use compressive force, like a press, this way or this way, what can happen is that steel and copper bend at different rates. They deform at different rates, just like different grades of steel can, which to a lesser extent, but steel and copper very, very differently. And so you might actually get, when you strike this way, it's going to bow out like this. It's a process called upsetting. But it may actually separate your copper layer like this, creating a delamination. You can see my horrific chalk drawing here. This delamination is basically where the copper has popped away from the steel. Now, correct technique will avoid this. It won't happen. But there's always a risk that it will. Every strike that you do on the end, there's always a risk. No matter how small, there is a risk. So why bother taking the risk? Now, there's a myth or a misconception out there that's sort of just based in, let's face it, wank, that a forged blade is superior to a stock removed blade. And you'll have people swear black and blue to you that there are benefits to doing it one way or the other, that, forging the steel compresses the steel molecules and makes it harden better and everything. It's all lies. This has been chemically tested in the field of metallurgy. There is no benefit. The only benefit you could possibly get would be to control the patination of the copper. But let me tell you, there are ways to do that without forging it. And there are ways to do that that don't involve the risk of delamination. So Like I said before, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Why go through all of that effort, and it is effort, let me tell you, to make a billet of CuMai, only to introduce potential for risk when you don't have to? And I'm actually going to show you that using what's called a reward matrix. It's a thing that's commonly used in the field of game theory, which I used to work in. And it perfectly outlines why you should avoid hitting the ends of your CuMai. Okay, so here we have a reward matrix. On the vertical axis is the risk, and on the horizontal axis is the reward. So where would you put a forged one, given that there is a risk of delaminations? No matter how good you are at forging technique, there is a risk of delaminations. So I would say that the reward, potentially good. You can control the patination, etc., and then that's about it. Because at the end of the day, the end result, nobody's going to be able to know whether or not you have forged it or stock removed it. So it's CuMai. It looks great, but your risk is high. So we're going to put that up here. And if you stock remove from something that's only ever had that compressive force along the flats, there's very little risk, because if you've done all of your compression thoroughly across the billet, which in order to draw it down to size, let me tell you, you have, so long as you've been doing it at heat, your risk is very low, but you still end up with a billet of CuMai at the end of it. So I'd go for the low risk option, given that the end result is exactly the same. Here is not having CuMai. Here is having a bar of CuMai. Now, if you're going to end up at the same destination regardless, would you take path A, that is just smooth sailing and there's very little risk and you can have a bit of a sing-song? Or would you take path B, which is introducing unnecessary risk to get to the end result, which is exactly the same as taking path A? Now, if you're the sort of person that thinks that taking path B is the right idea, you're just trying to prove something. So when you are starting out making CuMai, take the road that introduces the least risk possible. Once you're advanced, take all the crazy loop-de-loops roads that you want. But when you're starting out, and that's what this tutorial's about, people starting out, take this road. I've been making CuMai now for 18 months. I still take this road, because I don't want to have to find a DLAM 2/3 of the way through a project. And of course, I'm saying that from the perspective of if you're a beginner doing this. If you're competent and confident doing work with CuMai, then treat it however you want. But people who are competent and confident using CuMai won't be going to look for a YouTube tutorial on it. This is aimed at beginners who want to try it out for the first time, or maybe they've tried it in the past and had failures and they want to try and get it all working. This is what this is aimed for, and I absolutely do not recommend forging if you are in this position. Once you've trained up and you're good with it and you're confident with it, you know how it moves, you know how it works, go for it. You will still introduce a risk that doesn't need to be there. Oh boy, you just watch the comments pile up down below because I put out a controversial topic. Can't say the C word in this modern day and age. Good heavens, Alex. Ha 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 ha. If you're interested, by the way, in learning how to make your own pattern welded steels, and I don't just mean Damascus, I mean where you should really start as a beginner, making things like sanmai or gomai, starting to play with things like nickel and copper in there just to make it a little bit more spicy. If you want to have a start to finish guide on all of that, I actually do have an online course that I'll put a link in the description below. Check out that course, because it's I think about 2 hours long of just non-stop information and practical examples that you can do at home with minimal equipment. You don't need fancy presses and power hammers and things like that. It's stuff you can do at home with just a basic setup, and it'll get you making fancy steels and minimize the risk of failure. So it's a good way to up your game and help you start understanding what's going on, because you know me, I like talking about the why of things a lot, and if you know why things are happening in your pattern welded billets, then you'll have a much better chance of success. So let's go through scenes from the old video and I'll tell you whether or not they are, I still consider them to be accurate or inaccurate. First one. Once we have it looking homogeneous, looking flat, and we know that that set has happened in there, it's time to bring that temperature right up. I'm talking to like a forge welding heat. The steel on the outside is going to protect it, but you want to draw that billet out, flatten it down so that it gets closer to the dimension that you're looking for. False. You don't necessarily need to get that hot. You can, it will work. It does introduce the chance of squeeze out, which is risky. There's still a risk of squeeze out if you're doing it in like a gas forge at brazing temperatures, because you can't necessarily control the heat as well as something like a kiln. Although, you know, if you know your forge, you should be able to do it. You can also get those infrared thermometers or a thermocouple that goes into your forge, and you can control your temperatures pretty damn accurately that way. But don't need to get it that hot. A bright red or a extremely dull orange should be more than enough. You don't need that thing to be screaming white hot. Second thing. Step 3. Get some thin gauge sheet steel and seal that billet around. Create a jacket for it, sealing up any and all air holes. So I recommended in the video to put sheet steel down the sides in order to fully seal the billet. Now, fully sealing the billet, I still recommend. Also, not 100% necessary if you're maintaining just brazing temperatures, but it will create that sort of little sandwich sealed, packet that will prevent any copper from squeezing out. If you're controlling your temperatures, you don't really need to, and actually running weld beads down the side of your billet will save you a bit of effort in the setup, so long as you trust your welding to not have any porosity on it. Because it's not just a matter of how good your welds are when you put them on, it's how good your welds hold up over the course of squishing that billet down and drawing it out. Porosity can open up. Little holes can open up. But like I said, if you're controlling your temperature enough that you're only achieving brazing heats, small amounts of porosity in the billet are not going to be a problem. Just always consider the outside edge of your CuMai billet, maybe like an 1/8 inch, to be pretty much a write-off. It's just part of it. It's the same as making Damascus. You know how you lose the ends? You probably lose the sides as well. It's similar in that regard. But the sheet steel is just an added bit of security. If you're half decent at welding, that should do just fine. Thirdly, so be careful. Do not work the sides. Stick on the top and the bottom. You can flip it 180 degrees, but we don't want those sides to weld. Very much still stand by this statement. Despite what anybody else will tell you, I wouldn't recommend it. Yes, it is possible. No, I wouldn't recommend it. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. If you're putting all this effort into making a billet of CuMai, why introduce the risk? Fourthly, you're going to need to put a resist across the cutting edge and CuMai layer, or the copper layer, before putting it in ferric chloride. And you're going to have to do it on each pass of the etch and polish. And it's a meticulous process, but it's the only way you're going to allow that copper to survive in the ferric chloride environment. Now this is a bonus one. I actually went through in this and masked the copper off for my etch. Now I'd still recommend doing this, and I don't really outline it in the video, but when you put copper in ferric chloride, it will sort of infect the ferric chloride, and it will leave copper particles in there, floating, suspended in the ferric chloride. And when you go to etch a piece of just normal Damascus or Sanmai or Gomai or something, it will sort of plate that with copper, a thin layer of copper, and it comes off very easily. I know that sounds exciting to somebody new to this. You think, oh cool, copper plating and all that sort of thing. It's a really thin, insubstantial coating that's more annoying than anything, trust me. So what I advise doing is, if you're going to be playing with CuMai only a little, mask it off. And in the video, to answer a lot of questions that I got, I was using liquid paper pen. You know those things when you make a mistake on a piece of paper and you can use that? Liquid paper is a really good resist. You can also use nail polish, although when it comes to nail polish, certain colors work and some don't. I found that poo brown and hot pink are probably the best to use. Do it together for added design benefits. And then it just wipes off with acetone afterwards. But if you're going to be doing CuMai a lot and working with copper a lot, do what I do and have a separate etching solution. I've got two etching tanks. I've got one that's ferric chloride that's only ever had steel in it, and one that's ferric chloride that also is allowed to have copper in it, and never shall the two mix. And then you can just etch the whole thing. It doesn't eat away as fast as I originally thought it was. Now, I'm coming from a background where I used to do a lot with robotics, and in there you make your own circuit boards, and we used to use ferric chloride to etch circuit boards. And so my understanding was that ferric chloride eats copper very quickly. But it's not that quick. If you're doing 15 or 20 minute etch cycles in, say, a 1:4 ratio of ferric chloride, you can quite safely leave it in there without losing all of your copper. Once again, I imagine that does depend on the grade of copper. We think of copper as an element because it is, but what the copper you buy is often a sort of an alloy of copper. So different alloys will be eaten away at different rates. Experiment to find out what works for you, or if you are unsure, just do the resist, because that works really well. So hopefully that clarifies and updates people on the video. Please don't look at something that I did 18 months ago and think that I'm still doing it exactly the same way. I put that video out simply because nobody else was doing it. I mean, this is a technique that is at least 500 years old. It's an old Japanese technique. It's been around for a very long time. I had several people think that I was stepping on their toes by putting that tutorial out. And that wasn't my intent, but I don't like people holding on to information that should be freely available. And so since then, so many people have been playing with CuMai. It's been awesome to see, and we've kind of normalized it in the knife making game. But better than that, we've had people innovate with it, and we've had some people doing some really cool stuff with it that was previously unseen, and that is awesome. And it's not me doing it, let me tell you. My stuff is pretty tame in comparison to what other people are achieving with their CuMai. So good on them. I love seeing innovation in the knife making community, but let me tell you, after over 18 months, I've innovated a bit myself and changed my technique. So I wanted to update everybody so that you had a more up-to-date understanding of how I do CuMai. I've gotten so many wonderful messages of people who have thanked me for putting that tutorial out there, who have sent me progress photos and asked me additional questions, and people trying it who thought that they would never be able to do that themselves. And it's just awesome to see. So keep that stuff up. If ever you use something of mine to innovate yourself or up your game, I want to see, because I want to be able to personally congratulate you for it. But to everybody else, I hope you're all doing well, and I will catch you on the next video. Thanks. So if you enjoy this kind of content, consider subscribing. And all the relevant links to follow me are all down below. I'll catch you guys in the next video.
Take this from me, it's like I'm singing in my sleep.